The dust swirled around Jackson Elwood's boots as he limped down Tuckson's Main Street, the thud of his cane punctuating each labored step like a metronome counting beats of a life slowed to a painful crawl. The year was 1878, and the Arizona Territory still belonged more to men with fast guns than to those who couldn't stand steady enough to draw one. Jackson had once been the former. Now, at 32, he was decidedly the latter. The midday sun beat down mercilessly as Jackson made his way toward the general store, his face weathered beyond his years from long days on the range before a stray bullet, and a spooked horse had shattered his right leg 18 months ago. The break had never healed proper, leaving him with a permanent limp and a lingering bitterness as deep as the Grand Canyon. "Afternoon, Mr. Elwood," called Mrs. Patterson from her millinery shop. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Jackson tipped his hat but didn't slow his pace. Beautiful days were for men who could still mount a horse without wincing. Beautiful days were for cowboys who hadn't become half the man they once were. The general store's bell jangled as he pushed through the door, the familiar smell of coffee beans, leather, and tobacco greeting him. Old man Turner nodded from behind the counter where he was helping a customer, a woman Jackson didn't recognize, which was unusual in a town the size of Tucson. "Be right with you, Jackson," Turner called. Jackson nodded and moved toward the back of the store, pretending to examine a display of canned peaches while stealing glances at the stranger. She stood tall and confident, her chestnut hair pulled back in a practical bun, though a few stubborn tendrils had escaped to frame her face. Her dress was simple but well made, the deep blue fabric complementing her sun-kissed skin. "That's everything on your list, Miss Sullivan," Turner said, pushing a small stack of goods across the counter. "Thank you kindly," she replied, her voice carrying a slight Eastern accent. "And you're certain the position hasn't been filled? Far as I know, the schoolhouse is still looking for a teacher. Town council meets tomorrow evening if you're interested in presenting yourself." She smiled, and Jackson found himself staring. "I'll do that. Thank you again for your help." She gathered her purchases and turned, catching Jackson's eye. For a moment he forgot himself and stared openly at her striking green eyes. Then, remembering his manners, he awkwardly tipped his hat. "Madam," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She nodded politely in return and brushed past him, the scent of lavender lingering in her wake. "Who's that?" Jackson asked once she'd left, approaching the counter. Turner chuckled. "Grace Sullivan. Just arrived on yesterday's stage from Boston. Came all this way to be our new schoolteacher if the council approves. Educated woman by the sound of her," Jackson grunted. "Seems awful young to be traveling alone to the territories." 24, she said, "and determined as they come. Reminded me of your sister Abigail before she married and moved to California." Turner began assembling Jackson's usual monthly supplies. "Speaking of determined women, how's that ranch of yours holding up?" Jackson's jaw tightened. "Getting by." The truth was more complicated. The Circle E ranch was surviving, but barely. Without being able to work the cattle properly, Jackson had been forced to hire extra hands he could scarcely afford. The drought hadn't helped matters, and the bank was growing impatient about his loans. "You ever think about selling?" Turner asked, wrapping a pound of coffee in brown paper. "To who? Hartley?" Jackson scoffed, referring to the wealthy rancher who'd been eyeing his land for years. "I'd sooner burn it to the ground," Turner nodded, having expected that answer. "Just asking, times are hard all over." "I'll manage," Jackson said curtly, counting out coins for his purchases. "Always have." But as he loaded his supplies into the wagon outside, Jackson wondered how much longer that would be true. The Circle E had been his father's dream, built with sweat and determination. Now it was slipping through Jackson's fingers like the desert sand, and his crippled leg made him powerless to stop it. 3 days later, Jackson sat at the back of the town hall as Mayor Whitfield introduced Grace Sullivan to the gathered townspeople. The schoolhouse had been without a teacher since old Mrs. Hendricks had passed away in the winter, and the children of Tucson were running wild. "Miss Sullivan comes highly recommended from the Boston Ladies' Seminary," the mayor announced proudly. "She holds degrees in literature and mathematics, and has experience teaching children of all ages. Grace stood before the crowd in a simple emerald dress that matched her eyes, her composure unwavering despite the scrutiny of the entire town. Some of the older women whispered behind their fans, clearly finding fault with the young, unmarried teacher, while most of the men simply stared appreciatively. "Thank you, Mayor Whitfield," Grace said when he finished his introduction. "I'm honored to be considered for this position. I believe education is the foundation upon which civilization is built, even here in the territories. Perhaps especially here." Her voice carried confidence and conviction, and Jackson found himself leaning forward to hear better. "I intend to establish a curriculum that includes not only reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also history, science, and the arts. Every child deserves the chance to expand their horizons beyond their immediate surroundings." "That's all well and good, Miss Sullivan," interrupted Harriet Doyle, the banker's wife and self-appointed arbiter of propriety in Tucson. "But what about moral instruction? Will you be teaching from the good book?" Grace smiled patiently. "Religious instruction is certainly important, Mrs. Doyle, but I believe that's best left to parents and the church. The schoolhouse will focus on academic subjects." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jackson bit back a smile, admiring her direct approach. Few women would stand their ground so firmly in a town like Tucson. "And what about discipline?" asked Harold Mackenzie, whose 3 boys were known as the worst troublemakers in town. Mrs. Hendricks wasn't afraid to use the switch when necessary. "I find that children respond better to respect than fear, Mr. Mackenzie," Grace replied. "That said, I maintain strict standards of behavior and expect them to be met." The meeting continued for another hour, with Grace answering questions with intelligence and occasional flashes of wit that surprised laughter from even her most skeptical audience members. By the end, even Harriet Doyle seemed grudgingly impressed, and the town council voted unanimously to hire her. As people filed out of the hall, Jackson hung back. He had no children and no reason to concern himself with the new schoolteacher, yet he found himself unable to leave. When the crowd thinned enough that he wouldn't have to engage in small talk with neighbors, he rose painfully to his feet and made his way toward the exit. Grace was gathering her papers at the front of the room when she looked up and caught his eye. Recognition flickered across her face. "From the general store, yes," she asked as he approached. "Mr. Elwood, Jackson Elwood," he supplied, tipping his hat. "Just wanted to say welcome to Tucson, Miss Sullivan. You handled that crowd better than most politicians I've seen." She laughed, the sound bright in the emptying hall. "Thank you, Mr. Elwood, though I suspect some of them are merely reserving judgment until they see how I manage their children." True enough. The Mackenzie boys alone would test the patience of a saint. "I've taught reformatory children in Boston," she said with a confident smile. "I suspect the Mackenzie boys will find me more difficult to rattle than they anticipate." Jackson nodded, suddenly aware that he was lingering without purpose. "Well, good luck to you, Miss Sullivan. Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "The mayor mentioned you have a ranch outside town." "The Circle E, that's right. I've been looking for a suitable place to board. The hotel is rather expensive for a teacher's salary, and Mrs. Doyle kindly offered me a room, but—" She trailed off diplomatically. Jackson understood perfectly. Living under Harriet Doyle's roof would mean submitting to her constant supervision and judgment. "My ranch isn't suitable for boarding, I'm afraid," Jackson said. "But Martha Wilson at the edge of town takes in boarders. Decent woman, good cook, minds her own business." Grace's face brightened. "That sounds perfect. Thank you, Mr. Elwood." Jackson tipped his hat again and turned to leave, the thud of his cane echoing in the nearly empty hall. "Mr. Elwood," Grace called after him. When he paused and looked back, she said, "I noticed your injury." "If you don't mind my asking, was it a war wound?" "No, madam," he replied stiffly, "just a riding accident." "I see. Well, good evening to you." "Evening, Miss Sullivan." As Jackson made his slow way back to his wagon, he wondered why he'd been so abrupt. Plenty of men had asked about his leg, and he'd answered easily enough. Something about Grace Sullivan's direct green gaze made him feel exposed in a way that unsettled him. The schoolhouse opened the following Monday, and life in Tucson adjusted to accommodate the new teacher. Jackson heard reports from town about how Miss Sullivan had already begun transforming the dilapidated building, organizing the community to repair windows and desks, and setting up a small library with books she'd brought from back east. Even the Mackenzie boys seemed subdued under her firm but fair approach. Jackson kept his distance from town, focusing on his ranch and the constant struggle to keep it afloat. Spring was turning to summer, and the heat was building, making his leg ache more fiercely. The cattle needed to be moved to higher grazing grounds, but his foreman, Miguel, was down with a fever, and Jackson couldn't manage the drive with his bad leg. "We could wait another week, patron," suggested Raul, one of his longest-serving ranch hands, "until Miguel is better." "The cattle can't wait," Jackson said, squinting at the horizon where storm clouds were gathering. "If that's a real rain coming and not just a tease, the lower pasture will flood. We need to move them tomorrow." "She, patron," Raul nodded, though his expression remained concerned. "We will manage." But the next morning, as the hands prepared for the drive, Jackson knew they were understaffed. He cursed his useless leg for the 1,000th time, then made a decision. "Saddle my horse," he told Raul. "Patron, are you sure? Your leg, saddle my horse," Jackson repeated firmly. "I'm going." He hadn't been on a horse since the accident. The doctor in Tucson had warned him that riding again could re-damage the poorly healed bone, possibly leaving him completely unable to walk. But the Circle E was his responsibility, his father's legacy. The old bay gelding, Rusty, seemed to sense Jackson's nervousness as he awkwardly mounted. The pain shot through his leg immediately, but Jackson gritted his teeth and nudged the horse forward. He could do this. He had to. The cattle drive started smoothly enough. Jackson stayed toward the rear, directing the other hands while trying to minimize his own movement in the saddle. But as they approached the narrow pass that led to the upper pasture, the storm that had been threatening finally broke. The first drops of rain were fat and heavy, turning quickly into a downpour that reduced visibility to mere yards. Thunder cracked overhead, spooking the already nervous cattle. Before the hands could react, the herd began to scatter, some doubling back toward the lower pasture, others breaking for the hills. "Head them off," Jackson shouted, digging his heels into Rusty's flanks and racing toward a group of steers veering away from the pass. Pain lanced through his leg with every bounce in the saddle, but Jackson pushed through it, focused solely on preventing disaster. He managed to turn the cattle back toward the main herd, but as he wheeled Rusty around, a flash of lightning split the sky directly overhead. The boom of thunder was immediate and deafening. Rusty reared in terror, nearly unseating Jackson. As the horse came back down, his hoof caught in a prairie dog hole hidden by the rain-soaked grass. The animal stumbled, pitching forward, and Jackson felt himself being thrown. He hit the ground hard, his bad leg taking the brunt of the impact. The pain was blinding, immediate, and all-consuming. Jackson heard himself scream, the sound swallowed by the storm's fury. Through a haze of agony, he saw Rusty regain his footing and bolt away, leaving Jackson sprawled in the mud as rain pelted his face. Consciousness came and went. At some point, he was aware of hands lifting him, voices shouting over the storm. Pain spiked again as they moved him, and he welcomed the darkness when it came. He woke to the familiar ceiling of his bedroom at the ranch house. For a moment, he thought perhaps it had all been a nightmare: the cattle drive, the storm, the fall. Then he tried to move, and reality crashed back with excruciating clarity. "Easy there, boss," came Miguel's voice, surprisingly strong for someone who'd been feverish days before. "Doctor says you need to lie still." Jackson turned his head to see his foreman sitting in a chair beside the bed, looking pale but alert. "The cattle," Jackson rasped, "safe in the upper pasture. Raul and the boys got them through after they brought you back. Rusty, he's fine. Came back to the barn on his own, the smart old devil." Jackson closed his eyes in relief, then opened them again as another concern surfaced. "How bad is my leg?" Miguel's hesitation was answer enough. "Dr. Watson is coming back this afternoon." He said it again, but I made it worse," Jackson finished grimly. Miguel didn't contradict him. When Dr. Watson arrived, his diagnosis confirmed Jackson's fears. "The break has been significantly aggravated," the doctor said after examining the swollen, discolored limb. "I've done what I can to set it properly this time, but I must be honest with you, Mr. Elwood. You're likely to have even less mobility than before." Jackson stared at the ceiling, jaw clenched so tight he thought his teeth might crack. "What does that mean exactly, Doc?" "It means you'll need that cane for the rest of your life, son. And even with it, walking will be more difficult than it was before." The doctor left additional laudanum for the pain and instructions for care, but Jackson barely heard him. All he could think about was that he'd failed his father, failed the ranch, failed himself. His reckless decision to ride had cost him what little independence he'd managed to maintain. The next weeks passed in a haze of pain, bitter resentment, and grudging recovery. Jackson refused most of the laudanum, preferring the physical agony to the foggy detachment the drug induced. He needed to think clearly, to plan for the future of the Circle E now that he was even more of a cripple than before. By the end of July, he was able to move around the house with the cane, though each step was more painful and awkward than before his second injury. The ranch hands treated him with careful deference that only fueled his dark mood. Even Miguel, normally unfazed by Jackson's temperament, kept his distance except when necessary. It was during this bleak period that an unexpected visitor arrived at the Circle E. Jackson was sitting on the front porch, scowling at account books that showed a ranch sliding steadily toward bankruptcy, when he heard the approaching buggy. He squinted against the afternoon sun, surprised to recognize Grace Sullivan at the reins of a small rented rig from the livery stable. She pulled up in front of the house and set the brake before gathering a basket from the seat beside her. "Miss Sullivan," Jackson called from the porch, not bothering to stand, "this is an unexpected visit." Grace approached, looking cool despite the summer heat in a light cotton dress the color of desert sage. "Mr. Elwood, I heard about your accident. The Mackenzie boys witnessed the cattle drive and have been regaling the entire school with the tale." Jackson grimaced. "I'm sure they made it sound more exciting than it was. On the contrary, they seemed quite concerned. Bobby Mackenzie even included you in the class prayer yesterday, though he did mention that you used some interesting words when you fell." Her eyes twinkled with amusement. Despite himself, Jackson felt a smile tug at his lips. "I'm sure I did. So you've come all this way to tell me I've scandalized the youth of Tucson? I've come to bring you these," she replied, holding up the basket. "Mrs. Wilson, my landlady, thanks to your recommendation, bakes the most wonderful corn muffins, and I've included some books I thought might help pass the time during your recovery." Jackson was taken aback by the gesture. "That's very thoughtful but unnecessary." "Neighborliness is never unnecessary, Mr. Elwood." She set the basket on the small table beside his chair. "Besides, I had an ulterior motive for visiting. Oh, I've been developing a natural history curriculum for my older students. I'd like to organize an expedition to collect local plant specimens, and I was told your ranch has one of the most diverse landscapes in the area." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "You want to bring schoolchildren to my cattle ranch to pick flowers?" "To collect botanical specimens," she corrected primly, "and to observe the different ecosystems. Your ranch encompasses desert, grassland, and woodland environments, according to Mr. Turner." "Turner talks too much," Jackson muttered. Then, seeing her expression fall slightly, he added, "But he's not wrong. The Circle E does have a bit of everything." Grace brightened. "Then you wouldn't object. We would stay well away from your cattle operations, of course." Jackson should have refused. The last thing he needed was a group of town children tramping around his property, but something in her eager expression made it impossible to deny her request. "I suppose that would be all right," he conceded. "When did you have in mind?" "Next Friday." "The weather should be cooler by then, and I can arrange for wagons to transport the children." "Friday," Jackson nodded. "I'll have Miguel show you the best areas for your botanical expedition." "Actually," Grace said, her voice turning hesitant, I was hoping you might be willing to guide us yourself. The children would benefit greatly from hearing about the land from someone who knows it intimately." Jackson's refusal was immediate. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Miss Sullivan. As you can see," he gestured to his splinted leg, "I'm not in any condition to lead nature walks. The expedition will proceed at a gentle pace with frequent stops for observation and collection," she persisted. "And I believe fresh air and moderate activity would aid your recovery, according to modern medical thought." "Modern medical thought hasn't met my leg, Miss Sullivan." Grace studied him for a moment, her green eyes thoughtful. "Mr. Elwood, may I speak frankly?" "I doubt I could stop you if I tried." She smiled slightly at that. "I believe your physical recovery is progressing as well as can be expected. It's your spirit that concerns me." Jackson stiffened. "My spirit is none of your concern, Miss Sullivan." "Perhaps not," she agreed. "But as an educator, I cannot help but notice when someone is allowing circumstance to defeat them rather than adapting to it." Anger flared in Jackson's chest. "You know nothing about my circumstances." "I know that a man who built and maintains a ranch as fine as this one possesses intelligence, determination, and courage," Grace replied, unfazed by his anger. "Qualities that serve equally well in overcoming physical limitations." "Are you always this forthright with people you barely know, Miss Sullivan?" "Only when I believe they're capable of handling the truth." She gathered her skirts, preparing to leave. "Think about the expedition, Mr. Elwood. The children would be so grateful for your expertise, and I suspect the experience might benefit you as well." Before Jackson could formulate a suitably cutting response, she had turned and walked back to her buggy, climbing in with practiced ease. He watched her drive away, torn between irritation at her presumption and reluctant admiration for her boldness. Later that evening, as he sampled one of Mrs. Wilson's excellent corn muffins, Jackson found himself considering Grace's words. Was he allowing his injury to defeat his spirit? The very idea rankled, yet he couldn't entirely dismiss it. When Friday arrived, Jackson surprised himself and Miguel by announcing that he would indeed accompany the schoolteacher and her students on their nature expedition. "Are you certain, Patron?" Miguel asked, concern evident in his voice. "It is very soon after your accident. I'm certain I'm tired of staring at these four walls," Jackson replied gruffly. "Besides, someone needs to make sure those town children don't trample the south pasture." Miguel's knowing smile suggested he wasn't fooled by this explanation, but he wisely kept his thoughts to himself. The expedition arrived mid-morning, 2 wagons filled with children ranging from about 8 to 15 years old, with Grace perched on the driver's seat of the lead wagon, looking cool and composed despite the growing heat of the day. She wore a practical outfit, a divided riding skirt and a light blouse with a wide-brimmed hat shielding her face from the sun. "Mr. Elwood," she called, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure when she saw him waiting on the porch. "How wonderful that you've decided to join us." The children eyed him curiously as they climbed down from the wagons, some of them clearly intimidated by his stern countenance and the cane he leaned on heavily. "Class," Grace announced, "this is Mr. Elwood, who has very kindly agreed to share his knowledge of the land with us today. I expect you all to be on your best behavior and to listen attentively." A chorus of "yes." Miss Sullivan rose from the group. "Now, we'll begin by examining the native grasses of this region," Grace continued, gesturing toward a nearby meadow. "Mr. Elwood, would you lead the way at whatever pace is comfortable for you?" Jackson hesitated, suddenly aware of how slow and awkward his progress would be in front of these children. But the expectant faces looking up at him left little choice. Swallowing his pride, he began the painful process of descending the porch steps. To his surprise, none of the children seemed impatient or derisive. Instead, they fell in beside and behind him, matching their pace to his without comment. Grace walked at his side, pointing out features of the landscape and asking thoughtful questions that allowed him to share his knowledge without drawing attention to his halting gait. "Mr. Elwood, how can you tell which grasses are native and which were brought by settlers?" asked a serious-faced boy of about 12. Jackson found himself warming to the subject, explaining the differences in growth patterns and resilience to drought. The children listened with genuine interest, and soon Jackson was pointing out other features of the ranch: the best soil for growing, the signs of wildlife, the subtle indicators of water beneath the seemingly dry land. They stopped frequently, ostensibly for the children to collect specimens and make notes in their small journals, but Jackson suspected Grace was also ensuring he didn't overtax his strength. He found himself grudgingly appreciative of her thoughtfulness. As the morning wore on, Jackson realized he was enjoying himself. It had been years since he'd looked at his land through fresh eyes, seeing its beauty rather than just its challenges and shortcomings. The children's enthusiasm was infectious, their questions forcing him to articulate knowledge he'd taken for granted. By midday, they had reached a shady grove of cottonwoods beside a small creek, one of Jackson's favorite spots on the ranch, though he rarely visited it anymore. "This is the perfect place for our picnic lunch," Grace announced, and the children cheered, rushing to help unpack the baskets they'd brought. Jackson lowered himself carefully onto a fallen log, relieved to take the weight off his throbbing leg. Grace sat beside him, offering a cloth-wrapped sandwich. "The children are learning so much," she said softly. "Thank you for doing this." Jackson nodded, unexpectedly touched by her gratitude. "They're good kids, even the Mackenzie boys," Grace laughed. "They just needed the right motivation. Bobby has a genuine talent for drawing, and once I discovered that, his behavior improved dramatically." "You've made quite an impression on this town in a short time, Miss Sullivan," Jackson observed. She shrugged modestly. "I merely try to see potential where others might see problems." "Is that what I am? A problem you've identified potential in?" The words came out more sharply than he'd intended. Grace turned to face him directly, her expression serious. "No, Mr. Elwood, you're a man who suffered a setback and is struggling to redefine himself." "That's not a problem, it's simply human." Before Jackson could respond, they were interrupted by excited shouts from several children who had discovered a turtle in the creek. The moment passed, but Grace's words lingered in Jackson's mind throughout the afternoon. The expedition continued for another hour after lunch, with the group making a wide, slow circuit that eventually brought them back to the ranch house. The children were sun-flushed and happy, their collection bags bulging with carefully labeled specimens, their notebooks filled with observations and sketches. "Thank you, Mr. Elwood," they chorused as they climbed back into the wagons. "You're welcome back anytime," Jackson found himself saying, surprising himself with the sincerity of the invitation. As the others settled in, Grace lingered for a moment. "Would you consider another visit, Mr. Elwood? Perhaps just myself next time. I'd like to further discuss some of the plant uses you mentioned for my own education." Jackson hesitated only briefly. "I'd be happy to, Miss Sullivan." "Grace," she said with a smile. "Please call me Grace." "Jackson," he offered in return. "Until next time, Jackson." She climbed onto the wagon seat and took up the reins, her smile staying with him long after the dust from the departing wagons had settled. True to her word, Grace returned to the Circle E the following weekend, this time without students in tow. Jackson found himself watching the road for her arrival, an anticipation he hadn't felt in years lightening his usually dour mood. They spent the afternoon discussing the various uses of native plants, with Jackson sharing knowledge passed down from his father, who had learned from the local Apache. Grace took detailed notes, asking insightful questions that showed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. "You know," she said as they sat on the porch enjoying coffee, "you have a natural gift for teaching. The children haven't stopped talking about what they learned from you." Jackson snorted. "A crippled cowboy isn't exactly teacher material, Grace." "Why not? The most valuable education comes from experience, not textbooks." She set her cup down decisively. "In fact, I've been thinking about proposing a series of practical learning days for the older students. Local experts could share their knowledge ranching, blacksmithing, native crafts. Would you consider participating?" I'm not sure what I could teach that would be useful in a classroom. Animal husbandry, land management, weather prediction, all valuable skills in this territory. She leaned forward earnestly. Jackson, these children need to understand the place they live in, not just memorize facts about distant lands they may never see. Her passion was compelling, and Jackson found himself nodding despite his reservations. I suppose I could talk about cattle breeding or water conservation. Grace's face lit up. Wonderful, and perhaps, as your leg continues to heal, you might consider coming into town occasionally. The school has a small library that's sorely lacking in practical texts about the territories. Jackson rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. I might have some books that would be suitable. My father kept detailed journals about ranching in this region. That would be invaluable, Grace enthused. Historical primary sources are the best way to understand how this land was settled. As they continued talking, the sun began to set, painting the desert in gold and crimson. Jackson realized with some surprise that they had been conversing for hours without any awkward silences or painful awareness of his injury. Grace had a gift for making him forget his limitations, focusing instead on his knowledge and capabilities. I should head back to town before it gets dark, Grace said reluctantly, gathering her notes. You're welcome to stay for supper, Jackson offered. Miguel's wife, Elena, makes the best chiles rellenos in the territory. Grace hesitated, clearly tempted. Another time, perhaps. Mrs. Wilson worries if I'm out after dark. Of course, Jackson nodded, trying to hide his disappointment. Let me help you to your buggy. They walked slowly to where her rented rig was tied, Jackson's cane thumping rhythmically in the dust. As Grace climbed up, she paused, looking down at him with a thoughtful expression. There's a social at the schoolhouse next Saturday evening, she said, a fundraiser for new books and equipment. Would you consider attending? Jackson stiffened immediately. I don't do dances, Grace. It's not just dancing. There will be food, music, conversation, and dancing, he added firmly, which I can't do anymore. Something flickered in Grace's eyes, not pity, which he would have hated, but a kind of determination. Then I'll teach you. Teach me what? To dance again. She said it simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Jackson barked a harsh laugh. Have you not noticed the cane? The limp, I can barely walk, let alone dance. Dancing is just moving to music, Jackson. It doesn't have to be what you remember doing before. Her voice softened. Don't let what you've lost keep you from discovering new ways to live. Before he could formulate a response, she had flicked the reins and was driving away, leaving him standing in the yard with her words echoing in his ears. The week that followed was filled with an internal debate that left Jackson irritable and distracted. The idea of attending a social in town, of being the object of pitying glances and whispered comments, made his skin crawl. Yet the thought of seeing Grace in a setting outside the ranch or schoolroom held undeniable appeal. He found himself considering her offer to teach him to dance again. It seemed impossible, ridiculous even. But Grace had a way of making the impossible seem merely challenging, and challenges were something Jackson Elwood had never backed down from until his injury. Saturday arrived, and Jackson still hadn't made up his mind. He spent the morning checking the books, the afternoon inspecting the north pasture fences with Miguel. And as evening approached, he found himself standing in front of the small mirror in his bedroom, staring at the stranger reflected there. He'd trimmed his beard, which had grown wild during his convalescence. His best shirt, rarely worn since he seldom went to town, felt stiff and formal. The man in the mirror looked like a poor imitation of the Jackson Elwood who used to attend socials and dances without a second thought, always confident in his ability to lead a lady around the floor with skill and grace. Damn foolishness, he muttered, turning away from his reflection. But an hour later, he was in his buggy, driving toward town, his heart pounding like a green cowhand's on his first cattle drive. The schoolhouse was transformed for the evening, with paper lanterns strung from the porch and wildflowers arranged in mason jars on every available surface. The sound of a fiddle and guitar drifted through the open windows, along with laughter and conversation. Jackson sat in his buggy for several minutes, watching couples and families enter, before finally gathering his courage. He made his way slowly up the steps, painfully aware of his awkward gait. Inside, the room was crowded with what seemed like the entire population of Tucson. Several people greeted him with obvious surprise. He hadn't attended a town function since before his first injury. "Jackson Elwood, as I live and breathe," Mayor Whitfield boomed, clapping him on the shoulder. "Good to see you out and about, son." Jackson managed a tight smile, his eyes scanning the room for Grace. He found her near the makeshift refreshment table, looking radiant in a dress of deep burgundy, her chestnut hair arranged in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck. She was speaking animatedly with Mrs. Wilson and hadn't yet noticed his arrival. Working his way through the crowd was slow going, and by the time he reached the refreshment table, Grace had moved to the other side of the room where several couples were dancing to a lively reel. Jackson watched her, transfixed by the joy in her expression as she clapped in time with the music. When she finally turned and saw him, her entire face lit up in a way that made his breath catch. "Jackson," she exclaimed, hurrying over, "you came." "Seems I did," he replied, suddenly unsure what to do with his free hand. Grace solved that problem by taking it in her own. "I'm so glad. Come, let me introduce you to some people you may not know." For the next hour, Jackson found himself engaged in surprisingly enjoyable conversations with townsfolk he'd previously known only in passing. Grace had a gift for drawing people out, finding common interests, and smoothing over awkward moments. With her beside him, Jackson felt less self-conscious about his cane and his halting movements. As the evening progressed, the music slowed to a waltz. Couples moved to the cleared space in the center of the room, and Jackson felt a familiar pang of loss as he watched them glide effortlessly across the floor. "Come with me," Grace said suddenly, tugging gently at his arm. "Where?" Jackson asked, though he feared he knew the answer. "To dance, of course." She smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting the golden glow of the lanterns. "Grace, I told you, and I told you I would teach you," she interrupted. "Trust me, Jackson." Before he could protest further, she was leading him to a quiet corner of the room, partially screened from the main dance floor by a bookshelf. "Here," she said, positioning herself in front of him. "You can keep your cane in your right hand and I'll adapt." "This is ridiculous," Jackson muttered, though he didn't pull away. "This is living," Grace countered. She took his left hand and placed it lightly on her waist, then rested her right hand on his shoulder. "Now, you don't need to move much, just sway a little and I'll follow your lead." "Some lead," Jackson said bitterly. "A man who can barely stand upright." Grace's expression grew serious. "A man is more than his physical abilities, Jackson, much more." The waltz continued, its gentle rhythm seeming to beckon them. With a deep breath, Jackson began to sway slightly, shifting his weight carefully to avoid putting too much pressure on his bad leg. Grace moved with him, somehow making their limited movement feel like dancing. "See," she murmured, "we're dancing," and they were in their own way. It wasn't the vigorous, skillful dancing Jackson had once prided himself on, but there was an intimacy to this careful swaying that touched something deep within him. Grace was so close he could smell the lavender in her hair, could feel the warmth of her hand through his shirt. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly, the question that had been haunting him for weeks finally finding voice. Grace looked up at him, her eyes steady and clear. "Because from the moment I saw you in that general store, I recognized something in you, a strength that goes beyond the physical, a depth that most people miss because they only see the cane." "And what do you see?" "A man who loves his land enough to risk everything for it. A man who shares his knowledge generously with children who aren't his own. A man who faces each day with courage, even when it would be easier to give up." Her voice softened. "A man I've come to care for very much." Jackson's heart pounded so loudly he was certain she must hear it. "I'm not the man I was before, Grace. None of us are ever the same from one day to the next," she replied. "We're all constantly changing, adapting, becoming. The question is whether we embrace that change or fight against it." The music was drawing to a close, but Jackson found he didn't want this moment to end. Impulsively, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers, a gentle, questioning kiss. Grace responded without hesitation, her hand tightening slightly on his shoulder. When they parted, Jackson saw his own wonder reflected in her eyes. "I never expected you," he said softly. "Nor I you," she replied with a smile. "But here we are, dancing." The weeks that followed were filled with a happiness Jackson had believed lost to him forever. Grace visited the Circle E regularly, sometimes with students for educational excursions, sometimes alone. Together they explored the ranch, with Jackson pointing out hidden beauties he'd almost forgotten in his bitterness over what he could no longer do. In return, Grace brought new perspectives and ideas, including practical suggestions for making the ranch house more accessible for someone with limited mobility. Small changes, a railing here, a rearranged furniture arrangement there, made daily life significantly easier. Jackson began visiting town more frequently, initially just to see Grace, but gradually re-engaging with the community he'd withdrawn from after his injury. He contributed his father's journals to the school library and even agreed to speak to the older students about sustainable ranching practices. As summer turned to fall, Jackson found himself considering a future he hadn't dared imagine before Grace came into his life. The ranch was still struggling financially, but with Grace's encouragement, he'd begun exploring new approaches, shifting more toward breeding quality stock rather than maintaining a large herd, which required less intensive physical labor. One crisp October evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert gold, Jackson took Grace's hand in his. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about what you said the night of the social about embracing change rather than fighting it." Grace squeezed his hand encouragingly but remained silent, giving him space to continue. "I've spent so long mourning what I lost that I nearly missed seeing what I could gain," Jackson continued. "The ranch will never be what my father envisioned, but perhaps it can be something new, something better suited to the man I am now." "What are you thinking?" Grace asked. "What would you say to turning part of the Circle E into a school of sorts? A place where children and adults, for that matter, could learn practical skills for surviving and thriving in this territory. Ranching, farming, building, even some of the traditional knowledge I learned from the Apache." Grace's eyes widened. "Jackson, that's a wonderful idea." The children would benefit enormously from such practical education, and it could draw students from all over the territory. "It wouldn't be just for children," Jackson added. "Newcomers to the territory often struggle because they don't understand this land. We could offer courses for adults too." Grace asked softly, her eyes searching his. Jackson took a deep breath. "I was hoping. That is, I wondered if you might consider becoming a permanent part of this venture and my life." Understanding dawned in Grace's expression. "Jackson Elwood, are you proposing to me?" "Inelegantly, it seems," he replied with a rueful smile. "I'm not the smooth-talking cowboy I once was." "Thank goodness for that," Grace said, her eyes bright with emotion. "I much prefer the thoughtful, determined man you've become. Is that a yes?" In answer, Grace leaned forward and kissed him, her lips warm against his in the cooling evening air. "Yes," she whispered against his mouth. "1,000 times yes." They were married in the schoolhouse on Christmas Eve with the entire town in attendance. Jackson stood at the altar with his cane, no longer seeing it as a symbol of weakness, but simply as a tool that helped him navigate the world. Grace was radiant in a cream-colored dress, her eyes never leaving his as they spoke their vows. At the celebration afterward, they shared their first dance as husband and wife, a slow, swaying movement that accommodated Jackson's limitations while celebrating the unique rhythm they had found together. "Happy," Grace murmured as they moved carefully among the other dancing couples. "More than I ever thought possible," Jackson replied honestly. "You taught me more than how to dance again, Grace. You taught me how to live again." "We taught each other," she corrected gently, "and we'll keep learning together." As the winter snow fell softly outside and their friends and neighbors celebrated around them, Jackson held his wife close, marveling at the journey that had brought him from bitter isolation to this moment of profound joy. His leg would never fully heal, but his heart had mended completely, thanks to a determined schoolteacher who had seen beyond his cane to the man struggling to find his way back to life. By spring, they had transformed the east wing of the ranch house into a classroom, and the first students arrived, a mix of local children and adults eager to learn practical skills for frontier life. Grace continued teaching at the Tucson School while developing curricula for the Circle E Educational Center, as they called their new venture. Jackson discovered a talent for teaching that rivaled his former skill as a rancher. His patience with struggling students, his deep knowledge of the land, and his willingness to adapt traditional methods to suit individual needs made him an excellent instructor. The pain in his leg remained a constant companion, but it no longer defined him or limited his vision of what was possible. 5 years later, the Circle E was known throughout the Arizona Territory as a place of innovation and learning. Students came from as far as Phoenix and Yuma to study everything from water conservation to sustainable building techniques. The cattle operation continued on a smaller scale, providing both income and practical experience for students interested in ranching. And on a warm May evening, as Jackson sat on the porch with his 3-year-old son asleep on his lap and Grace beside him, her hand resting on her growing belly where their second child grew, he reflected on the strange and winding path that had led him here. "What are you thinking about?" Grace asked, noting his contemplative expression. "I was just remembering the day we met," Jackson replied, stroking his son's dark hair. "How angry I was at the world, how certain I was that my life was over because I couldn't ride or rope or dance the way I used to." Grace smiled, taking his free hand in hers. And now, Jackson looked around at the thriving ranch, at the students practicing roping techniques in the corral under Miguel's watchful eye, at the experimental garden where they were testing drought-resistant crops. Finally, his gaze returned to his sleeping son and his beautiful wife. "Now I understand that a man isn't measured by how fast he can run or how straight he can stand," he said quietly. "He's measured by what he builds, what he teaches, and who he loves." He squeezed her hand. "And by those standards, I'm the richest man in the territory." As the sun set over the desert they both loved, Jackson and Grace Elwood sat together in the gentle rhythm they had created, a dance of partnership, adaptation, and enduring love that had transformed not just their lives but the lives of everyone around them. The cowboy who had once walked with a cane and silence had found his voice, his purpose, and his heart's companion in a woman brave enough to show him that every ending contains the seeds of a new beginning, if only one has the courage to plant them.